On the morning I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my parents rolled their suitcases out the door, headed to Hawaii. Before they left, they handed me a gift. Inside was my wedding dress, the one we chose together. Now, scorched smelling of smoke and topped with a note that read, "Let's see how you get married now." I lost everything in a single morning, but from those ashes, I found myself again. On the morning of my wedding, I woke before the sun. The light in my childhood bedroom was a soft grey, barely cutting through the curtains. For a second, I didn't move, holding on to the stillness, believing in the version of the morning I'd rehearsed in my mind 100 times. There would be footsteps down the hall, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, and the smell of fresh coffee, my mother's ritual comfort when she never skipped. Laughter, movement, the steady hum of love and nerves. But when I sat up, there was nothing. No voices, no sounds, just the low creak of the old house adjusting to the early chill. I wrapped a robe around myself and padded out into the hallway. The silence followed me like a shadow. Downstairs, the kitchen was dark. The counter was clear, not a mug or crumb in sight. I checked the living room, empty. The garage door was closed. I even opened the basement door, as if my parents might somehow be hiding there, planning some elaborate surprise. But the house was hollow. There were no cars in the driveway, no note on the fridge, no familiar sound of my father's throat clearing behind his newspaper. I stood in the middle of the living room, my phone clenched in my hand, and waited for something to make sense. Nothing came. I opened my messages. No missed calls, no texts, just a calendar reminder: today, Emily and Daniel. That was it. I told myself to breathe. Maybe they'd run out for bagels. Maybe my mother had gone to pick up flowers. Maybe I'd just missed them. Maybe. I stared at the screen again, then slowly sank onto the couch. It wasn't just the silence. It was the absence of intention. My parents weren't the type to leave a morning like this to chance, especially not my mother. Margaret Claiborne had planned every moment of my life with surgical precision. First violin at 6, debate club at 11, the right kind of boyfriend by 17. She called it preparing me for success. I called it exhausting, but I followed the plan. I became what she wanted: polished, presentable, agreeable. And today, I was supposed to become the final product, a bride. Her triumph. Except she wasn't here. The house was still. I stood again, walked to the bay window in the dining room, and pulled the curtain back. The street was quiet. The neighbours' driveways were still full. No signs of early errands or surprise deliveries. And then, as I let the curtain fall, a strange thought surfaced, one I hadn't remembered in years. I was 8, sitting at the kitchen table while my mother iced a cake. It was someone's anniversary. She was humming. I asked if she was happy when she got married. She didn't stop icing. Just said I almost didn't go through with it, you know. I stood at the back of that church and thought, maybe I could just walk out. Maybe I should. I remember thinking it sounded like a story, something she said for effect, like the way she'd exaggerate how late I was born or how I used to eat dirt as a toddler. But the way she said it that day, it didn't sound like a joke. And now, standing in the empty house on what was supposed to be the biggest day of my life, I wondered if maybe it wasn't a story at all. Maybe it was a clue. I walked back upstairs slowly. The silence thick now, no longer just quiet, but suffocating. I passed the mirror in the hallway and saw myself barefoot, hair unbrushed, face pale. Not a bride, just a girl in a robe with too many questions and no one to ask. In my room, the dress still hung on the closet door untouched. Ivory silk, delicate lace sleeves, the one I'd picked after 3 separate fittings with my mother. She cried when I said yes to that dress, said I looked like royalty, said it was perfect. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. The longer I looked, the more unreal the whole day felt, like a set that had been abandoned, a show that had been cancelled and no one told the actors. My phone buzzed suddenly and my breath caught, but it was just a notification from a wedding app reminding me that the hairstylist would arrive at 9 a.m. I closed it quickly. The absurdity of it stung. I wanted to cry but didn't. There was a tightness in my throat, but the tears didn't come. Not yet. Instead, I stood again and walked to my desk. Opened the drawer where I kept a pen and a pad of notes. Wrote down one sentence in shaky cursive. They're gone. That was all. Just to make it real. Just to see it outside of my head. I didn't know what it meant yet. Didn't know where they went or why or when they'd be back. But I knew the day had changed. The plan had been rewritten. Or maybe it had never really been mine to begin with. The front door slammed. A sound so sharp and sudden, it snapped the air in two. I jumped heart-thudding feet, already moving toward the stairs before my mind caught up. When I reached the bottom, my parents were standing in the entryway. My mother wore her favourite travel dress, the blue one with the pressed pleats, and the belt she always looped twice. Her sunglasses sat perched on her head, not yet needed in the overcast morning light. My father was beside her suitcase in one hand, phone in the other, scrolling like it was just another Monday. They looked like they were heading to the airport, not like people who'd forgotten their daughter's wedding day. For a second, I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no words came. My mother saw me, gave a tight smile that didn't touch her eyes, and set something on the hallway table. It was a square box about the size of a hat box wrapped in shimmering gold paper, tied with a red ribbon. My father barely looked up. "Morning," he said, like we were passing in a hotel lobby. "Where are you going?" I finally asked, my voice thinner than I intended. My mother didn't answer at first. She adjusted her sleeve, then gestured to the box. "That's for you," she said. "A gift for your future." She didn't elaborate, just placed her sunglasses on her face and turned toward the door. "Wait," I said, stepping forward. "You're leaving today?" My mother looked over her shoulder. "Our flight leaves in an hour. We'll be in touch." My father gave me a quick pat on the shoulder as he passed. Not a hug, just contact, as if to prove he'd been there. And then they were gone. The door clicked shut behind them, and I stood in the entryway, barefoot robe still clinging to my shoulders, staring at the gold box. I didn't move for a long time. My fingers finally reached for the ribbon. The knot was tight, cleanly done. My mother had always been precise about presentation. Even when she baked, she used a ruler to space the cookies evenly. I pulled the ribbon loose and removed the lid. Inside, I saw folds of fabric ivory familiar. My breath caught. I reached in and lifted it. It was my wedding dress, or what was left of it. The fabric had been burned along the edges, the lace near the neckline warped and blackened. It smelled faintly of smoke, and something else, something sour like melted plastic. The silk had puckered in places. A section near the hem looked like it had been scorched deliberately, like someone had taken a lighter to it and waited. My throat tightened, but I didn't cry. There was a piece of paper folded neatly and placed on top of the bodice. I opened it slowly. 7 words written in my mother's elegant cursive. "Let's see how you get married now." No punctuation, no explanation, just that. My hands were shaking, but I forced them still. I stared at the words, tried to read between the lines, tried to make them mean something else. Maybe it was a joke, a cruel one. Maybe it wasn't about the dress, but about me, about control, about reminding me who had power and who didn't. I thought of all the times she told me how much this wedding meant to her, how she spent months planning every detail, ordering custom linens, arguing with the florist. And now, this, a dress she helped choose. A dress she claimed made me look like a queen, burned and returned like a challenge. Beneath the ruined dress, I noticed something else. A second piece of paper, older, the edges soft and worn, folded several times, its creases yellowing. I hesitated. Something about it felt different, less performative, more private. I didn't open it. Not yet. I placed it back into the box, closed the lid slowly, and stepped away. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught me again. Hair unbrushed, eyes wide, hands smudged with ash. I didn't look like someone about to get married. I looked like someone who had just lost something she couldn't quite name. My phone buzzed in my hand before I realised I was even still holding it. A name lit up the screen. Daniel. I stared at it for a second too long. Part of me wanted to let it ring out to pretend I hadn't seen it, hadn't felt the drop in my chest or the heat that crept into my cheeks. But I answered. Hello. My voice cracked on the second syllable. There was a pause. Then, his voice low, careful. Emily. Just hearing it made my eyes sting. He sounded tired, not like someone getting ready to stand at the altar. Where are you? I asked too quickly. Another pause. I'm in the car, he said. I've been driving for a couple hours. My hand gripped the phone tighter. A couple hours? Why, he sighed. I didn't know how to say this. I still don't, honestly, but I can't do it. It was like someone pressed pause on everything around me. The hallway went silent again. Even the air stopped moving. You can't do what I asked, already knowing, already hearing it between the words. The wedding, he said, all of it. I can't marry into your family, Emily. I thought I could. I thought if I loved you enough, it would be enough. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was just done, Daniel, I said. But my voice was thin, like a thread unraveling. My parents, what they did, it wasn't supposed to happen. It's not just what they did today, he cut in gently. It's everything. The way they look at me, the things they've said, the tension every time we're in the same room. I feel like I've been on trial for the past 2 years. He wasn't wrong. I had seen it too, the quiet judgment, the backhanded compliments, the way my mother asked about his job like she didn't believe it was real, the way my father never called him by his name, just your friend, but they don't speak for me. I said the words falling out too fast. This isn't about them, isn't it? He asked. Then, quieter, Emily, you asked me to lie for you when we first met your parents. Remember I did. It hit me like a splash of cold water. The week before I graduated college, I told Daniel to keep quiet about how I got in. The legacy admissions letter, the family name that opened doors, my uncle's call to the board. He wanted to be honest. I wanted to keep the illusion. You said it didn't matter, I whispered. It did, he replied. I did it for you, but it never stopped mattering. It always felt like there was a script I had to follow. Like if I said the wrong line, everything would collapse. I turned and leaned against the wall. My legs didn't trust me anymore. I love you, I said and meant it. I know, he answered soft. And I love you too. But love isn't supposed to feel like this. Like tiptoeing through a minefield. Like always wondering if today's the day someone decides I'm not good enough. I couldn't speak. I couldn't argue because deep down I knew he was right. I'd been so focused on making this day perfect that I hadn't noticed the cracks widening beneath it. And now everything had fallen through. I'm sorry, he said. I wanted to be strong enough. But I can't be a part of this. Not when your family doesn't want me, and not when you're still trying to make yourself into what they expect. He didn't say goodbye. The line just went quiet, and then the call ended. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the silence bleed back into the house. I don't know how long I stood in the hallway. Maybe minutes, maybe longer. The morning had already felt like a betrayal, but this was final. This was the chapter closing without punctuation. I walked slowly back to my room, sat on the floor beside the box and stared at the ribbon I had dropped. My hands moved on their own, brushing ash from my robe, folding the ruined dress, tucking the old letter back into the box. Something inside me wanted to scream, but instead, I sat there in the quiet, swallowing the guilt. I wasn't blameless. I hadn't protected Daniel the way I should have. I had let my parents build the walls and I had painted them pretty. By mid-afternoon, the house was too quiet to bear. My bridesmaids had come and gone, their awkward smiles and careful exits, punctuated by offers I didn't know how to accept. My dress still sat in its box, folded as carefully as something broken could be. I packed quickly my phone wallet, a few bills, and the dress stuffed into a plastic shopping bag. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't leave a note. I locked the front door like I wouldn't return. I caught a late bus to New York. I didn't choose the city for any reason beyond movement. I needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else where people didn't look at me like someone who'd just been left behind by two different men in the same day. The ride was quiet, filled with highway silence and the dull thrum of tires. I didn't sleep. My thoughts played on a loop my mother's note, Daniel's voice, the smell of burnt silk. The lights of the city blurred through the windows as we arrived, smudging everything into golden grey. I stepped off the bus with no real plan, walking south along avenues I barely recognised. It was cold. I hadn't brought a coat. The wind cut through my sleeves and I pulled the shopping bag close like it might offer warmth. The dress still smelled faintly like smoke, or maybe that was just in my mind. I passed glittering shops with mannequins dressed for lives I didn't live, couples holding hands, children pulling at their parents' arms. It all moved around me like a current I couldn't fight. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. Somewhere around Fifth Avenue, I slowed down. My feet ached and my shoulders sagged under the weight of a day I hadn't asked for. I found a bench under a tree that had lost most of its leaves. The park around it buzzed with movement, joggers, strollers, laughter that sounded like it belonged to another world. I sat down the bag at my feet, and for the first time all day, I let myself cry, not the composed tears people offer at weddings or funerals. This was something raw, gut deep. I sobbed until my chest hurt, until the noise around me faded into static. People passed, glanced, looked away. I must have looked unwell, red-eyed, hunched over a plastic bag like it held something sacred. And in a way, it did. My whole day, my whole plan, folded and singed inside a crinkled wrapper. "Miss," the voice came from somewhere just above my right shoulder. It was low, careful, with just enough warmth to cut through the haze. I looked up, blinking hard. A man stood there, maybe mid-30s tall, dark hair neatly combed back. He wore a navy wool coat and leather gloves, the kind of attire that said he belonged in this part of the city. But his expression wasn't pitying. It wasn't smug. It was concerned, genuinely. "Are you all right?" he asked. I almost laughed. It came out as a snort. "Do I look all right?" I asked, wiping my nose with the back of my sleeve before I could stop myself. "No," he admitted, but his voice stayed soft. "But that doesn't mean I should keep walking." I glanced at the bag at my feet, half hoping he wouldn't ask. He didn't. "Would you mind if I sat?" he asked. I shrugged. He took the other end of the bench, leaving space between us like a border of respect. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I know it's a cliché, but sometimes it helps to talk to a stranger. No history, no stakes." I looked at him. His face was open, not pushing, not performing concern. "What's your name?" I asked. "Henry," he said. "Goldsmith." "And you, Emily?" I said. "Claiborne." He didn't react to the name. Or, if he did, he masked it well. "Nice to meet you, Emily Claiborne," he said, like it was just an ordinary introduction. We sat for another beat. The city hummed around us. "Would you like some food?" he asked after a moment. "There's a place 2 blocks from here. Good soup, bad lighting, no strings, no pressure, just company." I hesitated. Part of me bristled. Every voice in my head warned me about trusting strangers. But I looked at him again, his posture, his steady gaze, and I felt something I hadn't felt all day: calm. "Okay," I said, surprising even myself. He waited for me to collect the bag, and then walked beside me without comment, as if I weren't carrying a piece of my ruined wedding in a piece of plastic. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push. And, for now, that was enough. We walked in quiet rhythm through narrow side streets until we reached a discreet hotel with a brass plaque and a doorman who greeted Henry by name. I wasn't sure what I expected: a crowded bar, maybe, or a trendy bistro with neon signs. But this place was quiet. Its lobby warmly lit with amber sconces and thick carpets that swallowed the sound of our steps. Henry led us through to the restaurant tucked near the back, all dark wood and velvet booths, candlelight flickering low. A hostess appeared and smiled as if we had a reservation. Within moments, we were seated at a corner table, away from the windows, the kind of place where voices didn't have to rise to be heard. A waiter came and Henry ordered for both of us. Tea for me, coffee for himself. A simple dinner, roast chicken, he said. No fuss. When we were alone again, I watched the steam curl up from the porcelain cup in front of me, buying time. Henry didn't say a word. He just sipped his coffee, his eyes never darting away or pressing me to begin. So I did. Slowly at first, then faster. The word started as a trickle, then became something else. A confession maybe, or a story I had never expected to tell a stranger. I told him about the house in Boston, about waking up alone, the echo of silence pressing in on all sides. I told him about the gold box, the burned dress, the note. My voice trembled when I quoted my mother. "Let's see how you get married now." He didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. I told him about Daniel, about the call, about the part of me that had known it was coming and ignored it anyway. I confessed things I hadn't even admitted to myself: how I'd asked Daniel to lie, how I'd tried to curate the version of me I thought my parents could stomach. I think I was trying to prove something. I said, my voice hoarse, that I could hold it all together, that if I just followed the plan, I'd be safe, that they'd love me for it. Henry leaned back slightly, hands wrapped around his cup. And now I met his eyes. Now I feel like I've spent the last 10 years building a life out of other people's expectations. And today it all burned. Literally. He didn't smile. He didn't offer pity. Just nodded slowly, like he knew that shape of grief well. After a moment, he said, "My wife died 3 years ago." The shift in tone was subtle, but I felt it like a window opening in winter. "I'm sorry," I said. "It was a suicide," he added, his voice even. We were already separated. I had just moved out. She struggled with depression for years, but she was very good at hiding it from the world, even from me. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. People like to ask why he continued, as if there's ever one reason, one thing you can circle in red ink and say, there, that's when it changed. But life isn't like that. Grief doesn't operate on a single thread. It's a whole tapestry you didn't know someone was weaving until it's too late. His fingers brushed a crease in the tablecloth absently. After she died, I kept asking myself if I had missed something obvious. A word, a look, some sign. And the truth is, maybe I did. Or maybe she just didn't want to be saved. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was something gentler, heavier. A space we both allowed. "You're the first person I've told that story in almost a year," he said quietly. "Why me?" I asked. He shrugged. "Because you're sitting here carrying your own wreckage." And I thought, maybe it would matter to hear that, even when everything breaks, even when it's not your fault, and somehow still feels like it is, you can still find your shape again. I looked down at the tea I hadn't touched. My fingers trembled slightly. "I don't know what shape I am right now." "That's okay," he said. "We can't fix people, but we can choose to stay beside them while they figure it out." There was something about the way he said it, not as a promise, not as a plea, just a truth laid bare. The food came and we ate in companionable silence. I didn't feel judged. I didn't feel handled. I felt seen. Not as a broken bride or a failed daughter, but just as a woman who didn't yet know what came next. And maybe that was enough for now. Back in the hotel room, Henry had quietly arranged for me. I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, the plastic shopping bag tucked neatly in the corner, its contents too loud in their silence. The scorched fabric had lost its anger now, just a strange weight in the room. But what held my attention was the thin folded sheet of paper I'd pulled from beneath the ruined lace earlier that day, the one I hadn't dared to open yet. It wasn't labelled, no greeting. Just age-yellowed paper and the neat, unmistakable slant of my mother's handwriting on the crease. I held it in my hand for a long time. Not because I was afraid of what it would say, but because I wasn't sure I could trust what it might mean. Finally, I unfolded it. The ink had faded slightly, and the edges curled in as if trying to protect the words from ever being read. June 3rd, 1987. It began. That was years before I was born. The letter wasn't addressed to anyone. Maybe it wasn't even meant to be sent. It read like a journal entry or a message to no one in particular. Still, I read. Today, I almost left. I had the car packed. The dress was still hanging in the closet, and I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the taillights of my own escape flicker in the dark. But I didn't go. I told myself it was just nerves. That love is supposed to be complicated, that he would get better, that I would grow into the life I didn't want. I stopped reading. My breath hitched. The words felt too close, like they weren't just hers. I forced myself to continue. My mother called me dramatic. My sister told me to get over it, that I had already said yes. So what difference did one more day make? I walked back into the house, left my suitcase in the trunk, and put on the dress. It didn't fit right. Nothing did. But I smiled for the pictures, like a good wife in training. I made vows I didn't believe, and everyone clapped. My mother cried, but not because she was happy, because I hadn't run. The page trembled in my hand. I had never imagined my mother as anything but composed, opinionated, decisive. But this voice, this terrified, cornered voice, felt like a stranger I should have known. Years pass. You build a life. You fill it with obligations, traditions, the things people say are supposed to matter. But the crack never seals. It just gets quieter. Sometimes I see young girls with eyes like mine used to be wide questioning, and I want to warn them. Run. Now. Before it's too late. But I never do. Because I didn't. So who am I to tell someone else how to be brave? My stomach twisted. It wasn't hate that drove her to destroy the dress. It was mourning. Mourning for her own escape, the one she aborted at the edge of a driveway. If I ever have a daughter, the next line read, I hope she chooses herself. I hope she looks at the map everyone hands her and draws something entirely new. And I hope I'll know how to let her go. There was no signature, no flourish at the end, just that haunting final line underlined twice. And somehow, even though I knew she hadn't written this for me, it still felt like a conversation we were finally having. I folded the letter back carefully, smoothing its creases. My mother hadn't punished me out of cruelty. She had lashed out from a wound so old and deep it had become part of her DNA. The burned dress wasn't just a symbol of destruction. It was inheritance. But not the kind I had to accept. I could see now how pain repeats itself in echoes until someone finally hears it and says, enough. I didn't cry, not then. There was nothing left to mourn. Just something left to rewrite. Just something left to rewrite. The next morning I found Henry in the hotel lobby with 2 coffees and a quiet look in his eyes like he already knew what I was going to say. I sat across from him, the letter folded in my coat pocket like a relic. I didn't pull it out. He didn't ask. He slid one of the coffees toward me, and I wrapped my hands around it more for the warmth than anything. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. "Where to next?" I hesitated. "You mentioned Connecticut," I said. "A house trees." "Quiet." He smiled slightly. "It's yours for as long as you want it." I looked out the lobby window. The city was already rushing past in streaks of movement, indifferent and familiar. "I need time," I said. "Not a rescue, not a replacement storyline, just space." He didn't flinch. I meant what I said he told me. No fixing, no expectations. Then, after a beat, I'd take you anywhere, Emily. Even marry you, if that's what you needed. My chest tightened, but not out of fear, not even sadness. Just recognition of how different this kind of offer was. One not rooted in control or escape. I smiled gently. "That's kind. But I think I need to stand on my own before I let anyone stand beside me." He nodded. No offense taken, no disappointment, just a quiet acceptance. We left the city that afternoon. Henry drove. I sat with the window cracked open slightly, letting the late winter air sting my face. The scorched wedding dress stayed tucked in the trunk along with the letter and the remnants of a life I wasn't taking forward. When we reached the house, his house, I didn't know what to expect. It was set back from the road, half swallowed by trees, and ivy with a wraparound porch, and the kind of stillness that hummed. He gave me a room at the back where the light came in soft, and the view was all pine needles and birdsong. "Stay as long as you like," he said. "Or not at all. There's a town nearby, a library, a bakery, the kind of places that remember your name after one visit." That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the dark give way to grey, then blue. I didn't make a plan. I just let myself be still. The next day, I walked into town. The air was colder than I expected, but I liked it. It kept me awake. I found the library by accident, an old brick building with windows that fogged in the corners. Inside, it smelled like paper and dust and memory. I asked if they needed help. The woman at the front desk blinked at me. "You mean a job?" I nodded. "Part-time, anything." She shrugged. "The afternoon girl just left. You can start tomorrow." I didn't tell her anything else. I liked the anonymity. I liked how my name meant nothing there. In the evenings, after shelving books and helping kids find the dinosaur section, for the 100th time I came home and opened my laptop. I didn't check the news. I didn't scroll. I opened a blank page and just typed. The first post was short. Day 1. My name isn't important. My story probably isn't either. But maybe the ashes of something are worth keeping if you sift through them long enough. I called it Letters from the Ashes. I didn't sign it. I didn't tell anyone, not even Henry. It was just for me. A place to speak without being seen, to untangle the knot of a life that had always been dictated, never authored. Every night I wrote a little more. Sometimes about my mother, sometimes about Daniel. Often just about small things. The smell of the library stacks the way the barista down the street always drew a heart in my foam, even when I looked like hell. I didn't expect anyone to read it, but someone did. Then, more. Comments appeared. Quiet thank yous, messages that said things like, "I didn't know anyone else had a mother like mine," or "You just put into words what I've never been able to say." I still didn't sign my name. It felt safer that way, but for the first time, my voice belonged to me. Not as a performance, not as a daughter or a fiancée, just as Emily. And it was enough. Mornings came quietly now, unhurried, with the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen downstairs and the hum of birdsong threading through the open windows. I found a rhythm not quite routine, but close library shifts, long walks, and an old journal beside the bed that I still hesitated to write in. Instead, I poured everything into the blog. Letters from the Ashes became a ritual. I never promoted it. No hashtags, no followers begged for. But still, it spread word by word. Comments came in slow trickles, quiet gratitude, shared wounds, strangers reaching out not for advice, but for the comfort of knowing someone else had cracked too. One Sunday, Henry invited me to his family's estate just north of town. Not the house where I was staying, this was the original one, the one he rarely talked about, tucked behind stone walls and thick groves of oak. No one's lived in it since I was a kid, he said as we pulled up the gravel drive. We kept the grounds up for a while, then let them go. My sister visits sometimes. Otherwise, it's just ghosts and squirrels. I stepped out of the car. The house was beautiful in a haunted sort of way, its edges softened by ivy and time. The windows blinked at us like half-lidded eyes. But it wasn't the house that drew me in. It was the garden, or what was left of it. Once it had been shaped and structured, raised beds, winding paths, stone borders. Now it was wild, half swallowed by weeds and neglect. Still something in it called to me. I crouched beside a patch of tangled rosemary, brushing aside dry leaves. This could come back, I said quietly. Henry watched me for a moment. My mother used to spend hours out here, he said. After my father died, it became her way of coping. Until it wasn't. He didn't explain what wasn't meant. He didn't need to. Over the next few weeks, I started coming back. Not to visit the house, but to tend the garden. No one asked me to. No one expected it. But every day I came with gloves, shears a thermos of tea, and something to dig into besides my own mind. Clearing weeds became a kind of meditation. Replanting lavender felt like reclaiming something. I didn't pretend to know what I was doing. That wasn't the point. One afternoon, Henry joined me. He didn't say much at first, just knelt beside me, pulling up vines with slow, thoughtful motions. At one point he asked, "Why do you think broken things comfort us?" I didn't answer right away. Maybe because they remind us we're not alone in being unfinished. He nodded. That's how I feel in this place. It never really belonged to me. It belonged to my mother's grief. I looked at him. Then sweat on his brow, his hands dirt-streaked. You don't talk about her much. No, he said, because she left in her own way, long before she died. After my wife. He trailed off. I waited. After she passed, I told myself I would never let anyone that close again. Not because I stopped believing in love, because I stopped trusting myself with it. I stayed quiet. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep someone talking. It's not just the fear of losing them, he said. It's the fear of what it turns you into when they're gone. I thought of my mother, her letter, her eyes the morning she handed me the gold-wrapped box. You're not wrong, I said, but shutting down doesn't protect anyone. It just extends the loss. He gave me a look then, not wounded, not defensive. Just real. You sound like someone who's already started forgiving. I shrugged. I'm still learning how. Later that night, I wrote a post. It wasn't planned. I just sat down and typed, "There are gardens inside all of us. Some get trampled, some get abandoned. But if you're lucky or stubborn, or just bored enough with your own pain, you start to clear the path back to them. You dig, you plant, you grow something new." I didn't name the estate. I didn't talk about Henry. But the comment section flooded again. People wrote about their own gardens, literal and metaphorical. One woman described pulling up the rose bushes her ex-husband had planted. Another man said he started tending his late wife's orchids, and for the first time in months, he slept through the night. I never replied to comments, but I read everyone. And slowly, it began to feel like I wasn't just writing to recover. I was writing to remind people they could too. By the end of August, the rosemary in the garden had started to bloom again. I took it as a sign, not from the universe exactly, but from something quieter inside myself. A kind of readiness. The air had shifted too crisper in the mornings, the light thinner golden. I caught myself humming once while clipping dead stems, and that was when I knew. Not that I was healed, not that I'd found all the answers, just that I was no longer afraid of beginning again. I walked back to the house that day and found Henry on the porch reading his glasses low on his nose. "You busy next Saturday?" I asked. He looked up curious. "I could be." I sat beside him. "I was thinking we could get married, if you still want to." He closed the book. "Emily," he said, not with surprise, but with something softer. Gratitude, maybe. Or relief? "Are you sure?" "No," I said, smiling. "But that's never stopped me before. Only now I want to walk into the unknown on my own feet." He nodded once. That was all. No big declarations. No ring. We didn't tell many people. Just his sister, Laura, the kind judge from town who once helped Henry with a zoning dispute, and the old willow tree that had grown stubbornly in the back corner of the estate, its branches weeping in slow grace over the grass. Laura brought a simple white dress, something she'd worn years ago for a summer gala. "It's got good luck stitched into the seams," she said, winking as she handed it over. She also brought a small box with a necklace tucked inside blue glass, warm in my palm, once worn by Henry's mother. I traced the edge of the pendant before clasping it around my neck. No veil, no bouquet, just the smell of early autumn and the faint sound of birds overhead. I didn't walk down an aisle. I walked across the lawn, barefoot, the hem of the dress brushing against my ankles, my heart not racing, but steady, grounded. Henry waited beneath the tree wearing a navy shirt and no tie, his hands tucked in his pockets like he'd been standing in that spot all his life waiting for me to arrive. Laura stood off to the side, phone in hand, eyes bright. The judge cleared his throat and said a few words about commitment and presence and the quiet strength of choosing one another, even after everything's fallen apart. We didn't make speeches. There was nothing to prove. Just hands finding hands. Just breath steadying. Just us. When the judge asked if I took Henry as my husband, I nodded. Yes. Clear. Small. Sure. And when he asked Henry the same, he looked at me like the only answer had ever been, yes. There was no applause. No cameras. Just the wind through the leaves and a soft exhale I didn't realise I'd been holding for years. We stayed under the willow for a while after the judge left. Laura brought lemonade in mason jars. I sipped mine and leaned against Henry's shoulder. "This doesn't feel like a wedding," I said. "It doesn't." "No," I said. "It feels like an arrival, like stepping onto land after drifting at sea." He kissed my temple. "Then, let's anchor here." Later that evening, we made dinner together. Roast chicken, rosemary potatoes from the garden, and a bottle of wine someone had left in the cellar years ago. We ate on the porch feet, up the sun dipping low behind the trees. I didn't post about it, not right away. It didn't belong to anyone else yet. But that night, before bed, I wrote a blog post. Just a few lines. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is not start over, but continue. Not with fanfare, not with perfection, but with honesty and a quiet hand held in yours. I didn't get the wedding I planned. I got the one that fit the person I've become. I paired those words with a single photo, the one Laura had taken under the willow tree. My back was to the camera, the hem of the borrowed dress lifting in the wind, Henry's hand gently at the small of my back. No faces, just posture, stillness, trust. I didn't expect much from posting it. Maybe a few quiet congratulations from strangers who'd followed the blog long enough to sense the shape of the journey, even if they didn't know the names. Maybe nothing at all. But by the time I finished my tea, the storm had already started. My phone lit up on the kitchen counter, one notification after another, then another. The first was a text from my mother. "What is this?" Then another, "How dare you?" I stared at the screen, my breath catching without warning. Then came a missed call from a number I recognized as my father's office. A voicemail, and then another. Then more messages. The tone shifted quickly from confusion to accusation. "You think you're a martyr now? Do you realize how many people have seen this? How many will know? You've humiliated us, Emily." I sat down slowly, not sure if it was fear or nausea that twisted in my stomach. I hadn't named them. I hadn't told their story. I had only told mine. But somehow, in doing that, I had touched a nerve so deep, it reacted like an exposed wire. I opened my laptop and checked the blog stats. The post had been shared. A lot. Something about that one photo, those quiet words, had struck a chord. People were commenting, reposting, quoting. Some with joy, others with stories of their own. It was what I had hoped for on some level, what any writer hopes for resonance. But I hadn't expected it to ricochet back to the one place I never meant to face again. I turned off the phone, but the ringing didn't stop in my body. My hands were still shaking as I closed the laptop, walked into the living room, and stood by the window. The willow tree swayed slightly in the wind, unaware of the digital storm brewing in my pocket. I thought about deleting the post, or disabling comments, or writing some neutralizing follow-up. But none of that would undo what had already broken. And more importantly, none of it would be true. Because the truth was, I had defied them, not out of cruelty, not to hurt, but simply by living a life that wasn't scripted by their pain. I had stepped outside the narrative, and for people who only know love through control, that looks like betrayal. I picked up an old notebook, one with frayed edges and half-finished thoughts, and sat on the floor beside the fireplace. I didn't know yet what I needed to say. I just knew I needed to say it somewhere, not in the blog, not in a text, just here in ink. I began the letter with no plan to send it. "Dear Mum and Dad," I wrote, "I know this isn't what you wanted, and maybe it never could have been. I'm not angry anymore, not in the way I used to be. I just can't keep pretending that love means disappearing, that approval means obedience, that being your daughter means shrinking to fit the shape you left me. I didn't burn the dress, but I understand now why you did. You weren't trying to stop me. You were trying to show me your pain. But your grief is not my prison, and your regrets are not my legacy." I paused. Exhale continued. "I got married under a tree, quietly, with bare feet, and I felt safe. That's all. I won't ask you to understand, but I do ask that you stop punishing me for not choosing your sadness, that you let me go in peace, because I'm already gone, and I'm not coming back to beg for something that never lived in your version of love." I finished the letter, folded it, tucked it between the pages of a book I hadn't read yet, not for closure, not for revenge, but for clarity. The wind picked up again outside, sending small leaves spiraling across the porch. I thought of all the versions of me still floating out there in their heads, the wayward daughter, the ungrateful bride, the public embarrassment. None of them were true. But I no longer needed them to believe me. That night, I posted one more line to the blog. Sometimes, surviving your own story means becoming the villain in someone else's. Let them name you what they need to. You know who you are. I closed the laptop gently, as if the weight of the words might break something if I moved too quickly. But the stillness that followed wasn't heavy. It was a kind of quiet I hadn't known before, like breathing out after holding it too long. The letter I wrote to my parents sat untouched in the book on the shelf, unopened by anyone but me. I hadn't written it for them. Not really. It became something else, a journal entry for the woman I might be 10 years from now. A breadcrumb for the version of me who might forget what it took to choose herself. I added one more note to the page's margin before tucking it away for good. If my child ever asks why Grandma never calls, I'll say some wounds aren't taught how to heal. Some people learn silence instead of sorry. It didn't feel cruel to write it. It felt merciful, like naming something without setting it on fire. I stopped waiting for a reply that would never come. Instead, I began to make something out of what remained. I found the ruined dress folded neatly at the back of my closet. The parts untouched by flames, still white, still soft, felt like a relic from another life. I cut a clean square from the train, the smallest part that held no ash, and framed it between glass, not as an artifact of pain, but as proof that I lived through it, that I didn't let it end me. The frame sat quietly on my desk beside a smooth river stone Henry had given me during one of our walks. It bore no label. I never explained it to guests. Some asked, most didn't. But I found that silence has a shape. It holds space the way sound sometimes can't. We started collecting little routines, things that belonged to no one else but us. Sunday mornings with the paper, Tuesdays with grilled cheese and tomato soup. Walks when the weather allowed, and silence when it didn't. No grand gestures, no dramatic reckonings, just the ordinary softness of a life that no longer needed explaining. I thought often of what forgiveness actually looked like, not the performance of reconciliation, but the private decision to stop bleeding from the same wound. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't want revenge. I just didn't want to carry their voices into every future room I entered. I began to write less on the blog, not because the story was over, but because it had rooted itself inside me. I didn't need to tell it every day. It had done its job. It had pointed me home. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, I ran my fingers along the spine of that unread novel, the one where the letter lived. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew what was in it. And I knew it wasn't unfinished, just closed. Henry found me that evening on the porch, the sky pink with spring light. He handed me a mug of tea and sat beside me without a word. We didn't talk about the past anymore, unless it came up gently like something found in an old coat pocket, unexpected but not unwelcome. He glanced at the frame on my desk inside visible through the window. "You kept part of the dress," he said softly. I nodded. It felt right, not to forget, just not to fear it anymore. He sipped his tea. Survival makes strange monuments? I smiled at that, and then I leaned my head on his shoulder, letting the silence fill the space where grief had once screamed. In the garden, the willow tree swayed again, softer this time. Not mourning. Just moving. A year later, the garden was in full bloom, and so was I. My hands rested on a quiet curve of my belly, the soft rhythm of a new heartbeat beneath skin. I hadn't expected this version of the story. Not so soon. Not ever, maybe. But when the doctor showed us the first ultrasound, Henry's fingers tightened around mine, and I knew we weren't rewriting the past anymore. We were building something entirely new. The blog that had once been a lifeline had grown into something else. A small following, then a feature, then a publisher, reaching out with curiosity and gentle encouragement. Letters from the Ashes became a book. I wrote most of it in the mornings before the sun rose, when the world felt clean and undemanding. I included entries from the beginning, let them stand unedited. I didn't want to make them wiser in hindsight. They needed to sound like the woman I was when I wrote them, raw, fractured, hopeful. The book wasn't a triumph story. It wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about surviving loss without turning bitter, about learning the shape of your own voice after a lifetime of echoing someone else's. The response surprised me. Messages from readers came quietly like the first flakes of snow, then steadily. Daughters who had walked away from mothers that never saw them. Sons who were always someone else's second choice. Women who had burned their own dresses figuratively or otherwise, just to feel in control of the wreckage. I didn't reply to all of them. I couldn't. But I read them. I let them shape me. I learned I wasn't alone, that my silence hadn't been a void but an invitation. Henry never tried to claim any part of my story. He read the book draft once early on and simply said, "You told it true." That was all. He wasn't the man who saved me. He was the man who sat beside me while I learned how to save myself. We didn't talk about my parents much anymore, not because we were afraid, but because there wasn't anything left to say. The last message from them had come months ago, brief clipped unsigned. I hadn't replied. I didn't burn it. I didn't frame it. I just let it fade like any echo eventually will. Some ghosts don't need exorcising. They just need to stop being summoned. In the evenings, Henry and I would sit under the willow, with our mugs watching the sky fade into lavender. We spoke about names sometimes. For the baby. For the chapter we were entering. And often, we said nothing at all. We didn't need to. One evening, I walked past the frame on my desk and paused. The fabric had yellowed slightly with time, and I found myself reaching out to adjust it. I didn't feel sorrow. I felt something closer to reverence. That scrap of cloth wasn't a scar. It was a boundary, a line drawn between who I had been and who I had become. I didn't want to forget her wide-eyed, hopeful waiting in the silence for someone to come find her, but I didn't want to be her anymore either. I left the office door open as I walked into the kitchen, where Henry stood sleeves rolled up, humming some unrecognisable tune as he chopped herbs. He looked up, grinned. "Baby wants lemon pasta again." I smiled. "Or I do." He kissed the top of my head, then went back to slicing. And just like that, the world felt anchored again. No ceremony, no climax, just life, quiet, steady hours. I sat down to write the final page of the book that night. I didn't dramatise it. I didn't add anything grand. I wrote it simply because the truth doesn't always need volume to be heard. I didn't marry to be loved. I married when I'd learned how to love without needing permission. And maybe if you're here listening to this now, you felt something like that too. Maybe your story didn't go the way you planned. Maybe your family didn't clap when you stood up for yourself. Maybe someone you trusted left without explanation. Or maybe the hurt came wrapped in a ribbon and a soft voice that said it was for your own good. If so, this story was for you. Because you're not broken for wanting love that doesn't come with conditions. You're not weak for needing time, space, or silence to reclaim who you are. You don't have to burn bridges with fire and rage. Sometimes walking away without shouting is the most powerful thing you can do. Right now, all over the world, people are quietly rewriting their lives. In therapists' offices, in anonymous online journals, in small support groups, and late-night text threads with strangers who simply say, "I see you." We're learning slowly that healing isn't about being fixed. It's about being held long enough to remember we were never broken to begin with. So if you're still in the middle of your story, lost, unsure, holding pieces of a life you didn't choose, take a breath. That's allowed. You don't have to rush toward resolution. Sometimes surviving is enough. Sometimes continuing is the bravest thing. And if this story helped you feel a little less alone, I'd love for you to stay. Subscribe if you'd like. There are more stories to come, not perfect ones, but real ones. For all of us who are still learning how to live softly, fiercely, and on our own terms. You are not alone in this. You never were.